Father said he loved me but told Groom I wasn't mentally stable enough to be a wife and shouldn't be trusted until my cousin found out, and confronted him at the wedding in front of everyone while I stood there in silence. I used to believe that weddings were a celebration of love and unity, a moment where two families come together with joy and open hearts. But mine turned out to be a twisted stage where masks fell and truths I wish I never knew came clawing to the surface, and I think a part of me stopped believing in family that day, not because love failed, but because the people who were supposed to protect and support me chose manipulation over honesty and betrayal over compassion, and I don't even know if I've ever fully recovered from what happened, because even now, I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes and feel that sting in my chest like I did when I looked into my father's eyes that evening and realized he'd been lying to me for months. I had always been close to him growing up. I mean, it was just me and him after my mom passed when I was a teenager, and I clung to that relationship like it was the only solid ground beneath my feet. He was my anchor, my voice of reason, the man who used to comb my hair before school when my hands shook too much to hold a brush, and he was the one who walked me through my first heartbreak, telling me not all people were cruel. That love takes time and strength, and that one day, I'd find someone who'd see the real me and never let go, and I believed him. I believed every word because I didn't know he was capable of breaking me worse than any boy ever had. But before I get to that, I should tell you how it all started, or at least how it looked before everything fell apart. I met someone kind and steady and warm in a way I hadn't felt in years, someone who understood my quiet pauses and the way I needed to double-check the locks 3 times before bed, someone who made me feel safe without ever making me feel small, and after a couple years together, we decided to get married. Nothing extravagant, just something beautiful and simple, with the people who mattered most around us, and I thought, naively I guess, that everyone was happy for me, especially my dad, who smiled and hugged me the day I told him, said he was proud, said he'd been waiting for this moment for years, and I clung to that, his words, his presence, because it felt like everything was finally aligning. Until it didn't, until I started to notice small things, little inconsistencies that I pushed aside at first because I didn't want to believe anything was wrong, like how my stepmother, who'd always been a bit distant but polite, suddenly started asking these oddly invasive questions, stuff like whether my fiancé had a stable job, or how much I made, or whether I was prepared for the responsibilities of marriage. And I laughed it off because, well, people ask stupid things sometimes, but her tone was always laced with this quiet disapproval, like she knew something I didn't. And then there was the way she spoke to my dad when she thought I wasn't listening, whispering behind closed doors, hushed arguments that would stop the moment I stepped into the hallway, and the way they'd both smile at me afterward felt fake, hollow, like they were covering something, but still, I let it go. Because that's what you do when you want to believe your family has your best interests at heart. You ignore the cold pit in your stomach and call it nerves. You keep moving forward. Especially when the wedding is only weeks away and there's seating charts and floral arrangements, and so much noise that it's hard to hear the warnings inside your own head. And then came the rehearsal dinner, the night everything shifted just slightly enough for me to start losing sleep. My father stood to give a toast, and it started sweet enough, a few jokes, a memory from my childhood, but then his voice changed, got heavier, like he was struggling to say something he didn't want to admit. And he ended it by saying he hoped I wasn't rushing into anything, that love was complicated. And that sometimes we mistake comfort for connection, and people laughed. Awkwardly, thinking it was some sort of joke, but I didn't laugh, because I could feel the weight of his words aimed directly at me, and that night, I cried in the bathroom, with the faucet running to drown out the sound, because my father had just publicly cast doubt on the one decision I felt most secure about, and when I asked him the next day what that was about, he just shrugged and said he was trying to be honest. That he only wanted what was best for me, and that maybe I should slow things down. Take more time, and when I asked him why he never said any of this earlier, why now, he said I wouldn't have listened, that I was too caught up in the fantasy to see the truth, and that stung, not just because he doubted me, but because he didn't trust me to make the right decision for myself, and suddenly I began to question everything. Was he right? Was I blinded by love? Or was something else going on? I started to spiral, I won't lie, because when the most important people in your life start to plant seeds of doubt, no matter how confident you are, those doubts grow, they blossom in the silence of your own fears, and you lose your balance. But still, I went down that aisle a week later, heart pounding in my chest like it might break through my ribs, but knowing that no matter what, this was my choice. And I had earned the right to stand in that white wedding dress proudly. But then, as the music started and the guests turned to look at me, something happened that felt like it belonged in some twisted dream, like some nightmare masquerading in soft lights and petals, because just as I made my first step down the aisle, a voice sliced through the air from the front pew. It was my cousin, of all people, someone I had shared childhood secrets and teenage heartbreaks with, someone I thought was on my side. And she stood up, right there, in front of the entire world, and said she needed to speak, that she couldn't let this wedding happen without saying the truth. At first I didn't even register what was happening, my mind couldn't process it fast enough, like everything around me was glitching, people murmuring, heads turning, my heart thudding in my ears like a war drum, and I remember gripping the bouquet so tightly the stems bent in my hand, and someone reached out to stop her, my aunt maybe, or one of the bridesmaids. But she wouldn't sit down, she just looked at me with this strange mixture of pity and panic, and said she was sorry but she couldn't let me walk into a life built on lies, and I think that was the moment my knees almost gave out, because it wasn't just what she was saying. It was the way she looked at my father when she said it, not at my fiancé, not at me, but at him. And something deep inside me broke loose, something primal and sharp, and before I could stop myself I asked her, my voice shaking, what she meant by that, and her lips trembled as she spoke, like she wasn't sure if she should say it or not. But it was already too late, she'd ripped the silence open and there was no way to put it back. And she said that my father had been interfering with the wedding behind my back, that he'd been feeding doubts into my fiancé's ear for weeks, questioning whether I was emotionally stable enough to be a good wife, whether I was trustworthy with money, and even whether I had unresolved trauma from my mother's death that would sabotage our marriage. And it didn't make sense at first, it sounded so absurd, like something from a bad drama, until I turned and saw the look on my father's face. Not guilt exactly, but resignation, like he was tired of pretending, tired of holding up the facade. And I knew, in that instant, she was telling the truth, and it was like the air got sucked out of the room, like I couldn't find my footing on the aisle anymore, and everything blurred around me as I tried to speak but my throat had gone dry, and I looked at my fiancé, searching his face for denial, for some kind of rejection of what was being said. But he just looked at me like he didn't know how to explain, and I realized then that he had known, maybe not all of it, maybe not the full extent, but he had listened to my father, absorbed those quiet manipulations, and never once told me. And I turned to my father, trembling, heart cracking wide open, and asked him why he would do this, why he would go behind my back and try to poison something so precious to me, and he said something I'll never forget. Even if I live to be 100. He said, because I know how easily you break, and I didn't want to watch you fall apart again. And that line, that one damn sentence, shattered everything, because it wasn't just about mistrust, it was about control, about him seeing me not as a grown woman capable of choosing her own path, but as this fragile thing that needed to be managed and guided. And maybe he thought he was protecting me, maybe in his twisted mind this was love, but all I heard was, you're not strong enough to live your own life. And in that moment, I hated him, hated the way he dressed his manipulation as concern, the way he played puppet master while I planned what was supposed to be the happiest day of my life. I dropped the bouquet, I think, or maybe someone took it from me, I honestly don't remember, because my hands were shaking so badly and my vision had narrowed into this tunnel of disbelief and grief, and I don't even know how I walked out of that room, how my legs carried me back down that aisle without collapsing, but I did. Past the whispering guests, past my wide-eyed relatives, past the photographer frozen mid-frame like he didn't know what to do, and outside, under the thick sky, I finally let myself cry deep, gut-wrenching sobs that came from someplace buried, not just from that moment, but from years of not realizing how much I had let him influence me, how many choices I had second-guessed because of a look, or a word, or a subtle shake of the head. And my fiancé followed me outside, said he didn't know how to bring it up, that he hadn't believed all of it, but he was scared, and he didn't want to lose my father's approval. And that was when I realized how far the damage had gone, that my father hadn't just undermined me, he'd created this quiet alliance behind my back, painting me as unstable and impulsive, and suddenly I saw all the red flags I had missed. The long silences when I talked about my plans, the times he asked me if I was sure I was ready, the vague suggestions that maybe we should wait a little longer, and I felt betrayed by both of them, because if you love someone, truly love them, you don't let someone else rewrite their story for them, and yet that's exactly what they did. My father, because he couldn't let go of his need to control, and my fiancé, because he lacked the spine to tell me the truth or stand up to the man who had once brushed my hair and told me I was strong. I didn't go back inside, not for hours, and by the time I did, most of the guests had left. The ceremony was obviously cancelled, and the air was thick with discomfort, with whispers and sidelong glances, and I walked up to my father, calm now in a way that scared even me, and I told him I was done, not just with the wedding, but with us. That until he learned to respect me as a woman and not just the daughter he needed to shelter. I didn't want him in my life, and he didn't argue, he just looked at me with eyes full of something that might have been sadness or regret, but I didn't care anymore, because I couldn't carry the weight of his projections on my shoulders any longer. I needed to be free, even if that meant being alone for a while, even if it meant unlearning everything I thought love looked like, because the version of love I had been given was rooted in fear, and I wanted something braver than that. In the days that followed, the silence was almost unbearable, not because people stopped talking. Oh, they didn't. The gossip swirled faster than I could blink. But because my phone barely rang, not from the people who mattered most anyway, and I realized how quickly support dissolves when things don't go the way others expect them to, and the loneliness was louder than anything anyone ever said. It echoed through the walls of my apartment, in the untouched wedding decorations piled near the front door, in the untouched wedding dress that still hung in the corner of my bedroom like a ghost of the life I almost had, and every morning I'd wake up hoping that maybe I dreamed it all, that maybe it was just cold feet and confusion, and the memory of my cousin's voice cracking in that quiet chapel was just my brain playing tricks on me. But it wasn't. It was real, every bit of it, and with each hour that passed I kept turning things over in my head, conversations, memories, moments I had dismissed as harmless but now took on a whole different meaning. Like the time months ago when my stepmother asked me if I thought I was really ready for a long-term commitment, or when my father insisted on handling the venue negotiations himself, and told me he just wanted to take the pressure off. And I'd let him, so grateful for the help, not realizing he was building leverage with every favor, weaving himself so tightly into the process that removing him would have unraveled everything. And it wasn't just about my wedding, I began to see, it was about a pattern, this quiet, strategic undermining that had been happening for years, disguised as guidance, wrapped in the language of protection. And I hadn't seen it because I wanted to believe in the version of my father who had held me during panic attacks and told me bedtime stories about how strong I was, not the man who saw my independence as a threat to his identity as my caretaker. And I think the most painful part was realizing that somewhere deep inside, I had let myself stay smaller than I needed to be, just to keep the peace, to avoid the tension, to stay the daughter he loved instead of the woman I was becoming. And when I confronted my cousin privately a few days later to ask her why she hadn't warned me sooner, why she waited until the ceremony to blow it all up, she cried, genuinely cried, and said she had tried to tell me without telling me, had dropped hints, asked questions, even begged my father to back off, but he wouldn't, and she finally snapped when she overheard him telling my fiancé that I would probably spiral after the wedding and become difficult once the high wore off, and that if things didn't work out, the prenup would protect him. And hearing that made something inside me curl up and go numb, because he had planned for my failure, anticipated it, spoken about it like it was inevitable, and I don't think I'd ever felt so dehumanized in my life, not by a stranger, but by the person who was supposed to be my foundation. And then I remembered the way he had reacted after my mother died, how he had pulled inward, controlling every aspect of our lives, from what I wore to who I spent time with, and how I had mistaken that control for love, had thanked him for being strong for both of us, when in reality he was terrified of losing control again and saw my growth as a threat. And slowly, painfully, I started to pull myself out of that fog, not in one dramatic moment but in small, painful steps. Canceling the honeymoon we never took, returning gifts with handwritten apologies, calling friends I hadn't spoken to in weeks and explaining the truth without needing to justify myself. And in those conversations, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in months, clarity, not just about what happened, but about what I wanted going forward, I wanted boundaries, not walls, but real, healthy boundaries. And I wanted relationships built on honesty, not fear, not guilt, and definitely not manipulation. And it was hard, God, it was hard, because part of me still loved him, still missed the version of him I had clung to, and there were nights I almost called, almost broke the silence just to hear his voice again. But I didn't, because every time I reached for the phone, I remembered how he looked at me when I asked why he did it, and how he believed what he did was justified, and I couldn't go back to that. Not unless he changed, not unless he understood the damage he caused, not just to me, but to my belief in love, in family, in the safety of trusting someone fully. And as for my fiancé, or ex-fiancé, I guess, we spoke once after everything, one long, painful conversation where I told him how much it hurt that he didn't tell me, that he let my father paint me as unstable instead of shutting it down. And he said he didn't realize the extent of it until it was too late, that he was trying to keep the peace, that he thought he could protect me by staying silent. But silence isn't protection, silence is betrayal in slow motion, and I told him that, gently, but firmly. And he cried, apologized, said he still loved me, but I didn't say it back, because love without courage isn't love I can trust, not anymore, and I needed to rebuild myself from the ashes of what that day burned down. I started therapy again, the real kind, not just quick check-ins, and I talked through the grief, the betrayal, the mourning of not just a failed wedding but the end of an illusion I had been living inside for most of my life. And my therapist said something that stuck with me. She said, "Sometimes people love you through the lens of their own fear, and that love becomes a cage, not a gift." And I felt that in my bones, because my father's love was always loudest when I was vulnerable, and now that I was trying to be whole, he didn't know where to place me anymore. The healing wasn't dramatic, it didn't come in a lightning strike or some cinematic moment of realization. It came in small, quiet choices. Waking up early and making coffee just for myself without thinking about who else needed it. Deleting the wedding planning apps from my phone without crying. Choosing not to go back and reread old messages, even when I missed him. Even when my chest ached for the version of us that might have made it if only things had been different. And slowly, those choices added up, not into happiness exactly, but into something like peace. And that was more than I had felt in months, maybe years. Because for the first time I wasn't trying to bend myself into someone else's version of who I should be. I was just existing, raw and messy and real, and that felt like enough. And then came the moment I dreaded but knew had to happen, the letter from my father, handwritten, pages long, the kind of letter that makes your hands tremble before you even open the envelope. And it started with apologies. Of course it did, but then it shifted, like it always did, into justifications, into explanations that sounded reasonable on the surface but still echoed with that same old voice. "I was protecting you. I only wanted what was best. You were vulnerable and I had to step in." And I read every word, twice, and then I folded the letter and put it in a drawer, not because I forgave him yet, but because I needed to stop holding that anger in my hands all the time, needed to set it down so I could breathe. And I still haven't written back. I don't know if I ever will, because forgiveness, when it comes, if it comes, will have to be on my terms, not on his timeline. And as for the people who watched it all unfold, who whispered and speculated and filled in the blanks with their own imagined dramas, I stopped caring about them, because this wasn't their story, this was my life, and I lived it, every breath of it, every ache and tremor and scream I never let out loud, and if surviving it with my sanity intact made some people uncomfortable, that wasn't my responsibility to fix. Some friends stayed close, some drifted, and that's okay, because grief has a way of revealing who really sees you and who only saw the version of you that made them feel comfortable, and I learned not to chase people who flinched at my pain. Months passed, and I started writing again, just little things, reflections, memories, pieces of myself I had buried in the rush to become someone's bride, and in those words I began to find myself again, not the daughter or the fiancée or the woman in the white dress frozen halfway down the aisle, but the version of me who could stand alone in the wreckage of something beautiful and still believe in rebuilding. Because I do still believe in love, strangely enough, not the kind that needs to be approved or defended or filtered through family politics, but the kind that sees you fully and stays, the kind that doesn't flinch when you raise your voice or fall apart or say, "I'm not okay." And maybe I haven't found that yet, or maybe I've just started learning to give it to myself first, which might be even more important. And if there's one thing I carry from all of this, one truth I will never forget, it's that silence can be more dangerous than anger, that the things people don't say often scream the loudest, and that love, real love, is not measured by how much someone tries to control you, but by how much they trust you to live your own truth, even when it's messy, even when it scares them, and especially when it doesn't include them. And I think back sometimes to the little girl who clung to her father's hand at her mother's funeral and promised herself she'd never be alone, and I wish I could reach through time and tell her that she wouldn't be, not in the way she feared, because even when people fail you, even when they betray the very thing they swore to protect, you still get to choose yourself, again and again. You still get to stand up, to walk away, to say, "This is not love," and to begin again. And I don't know where this path leads yet. I don't know what comes next, but I do know this. The day I walked away from that wedding wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of me finally listening to my own voice. And maybe that's the real ceremony, the quiet, trembling moment where you say yes to yourself.